Hello and welcome to this week's installment of ChatDPS. It's going to be a kind of a driven kind of an event this week. We're looking ahead at CPS 230, and we're going to get the governance view as well as the CISO view on what actually CPS is. And if you're ready for it, fantastic. If you haven't heard for it, you might want to stick around because it's kind of pertinent if you're under APRA. Um, we also take a dive into this scattered spider and how that's evolving. But let's start with our guru of governance, Robert Feldman, up to his neck deep in CPS 230. Robert, before I hand over to you. So from the 1st of July 2025, APRA regulated entities must comply with CPS 230, a new standard requiring entities to better manage operational risks and respond to business disruptions. So what are the significant dates and what's expected of organizations?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So a little bit of context, I guess. Where does CPS 230 come from? Draft of it's been around for a few years. It's been in consultation for quite some time with the key organizations, entities, and it came into effect, as you mentioned, just a few weeks ago on the 1st of July. So most, if not all, APRA regulated entities should already be in compliance with CPS 230 by now. And what's it all about? It's about increasing the resilience with an operation risk management focus. And part of the reason for this is the rising number of data breaches as they impact APRA regulated entities and the impacts of that. And we've seen lots of changes around critical infrastructure and legislation around that. And what's in CPS 230, you can see overlaps with SOCI, which is quite interesting. And so it's about resilience. It's in response to the increasing trend of data breaches. It's in response to issues like COVID and pandemics and how you deal with major disruption to your operations, whatever that might be, and sets out minimum standards in terms of expectations for APRA regulated entities. So that's the context. That's where it came from, and it's basically a consolidation of a number of other APRA standards. So they've consolidated it down into this one kind of super operational risk management standard. So what I thought I might do for this episode is kind of touch on some of the what I think is kind of key parts of this. It's here it is. It's 230. It's about 15 pages or so long, so there's not a lot to it. It's principles based. So they've tried to stay away from getting too prescriptive. So it has a bit of a choose your own adventure feel to it. And we'll get into that a little bit as we go through it. But I thought I might just start off by talking through the objectives. So it says the aim of this standard is to ensure that an APRA-related regulated entity is resilient to operational risks and disruptions. And so we'll get on to disruptions. And it says that an APRA-regulated entity's approach to operational risk must be appropriate to its size, business mix, and complexity. So that's the choose your own adventure. So you don't get a lot of detail, but obviously the expectation is that major banks will be dealing with 230 in a different way to much smaller entities which are regulated by APRA. And so the objectives that are set out, the key ones are identify and assess and manage its operational risks with effective internal controls, monitoring, and remediation. So that's the first key part of 230, operational risk management. The second key part of 230, be able to continue to deliver its critical operations within tolerance levels through severe disruptions with a credible business continuity plan. So this is about BCP, but there's some keywords in there, critical operations. It's got some stuff around tolerance, and then you've got to have a credible BCP. And then thirdly, effectively manage the risks associated with service providers with a comprehensive service provider management policy, formal agreements, and robust monitoring. So this is all your supply chain stuff, and we'll probably touch on it. But what's quite interesting is if you outsource your services to another provider, you generally call them a third party. In this particular standard, it talks about fourth parties. So if that service provider that you've outsourced to then subcontracts part of those services, they're a fourth party, and it considers fourth party risk and how you manage that. So some lots of really interesting objectives and principles in there. And unless you want to stop and say anything, I'll keep going if you like.
Yeah, is you going to sort of suggest that there's another playbook that's required around this as well?
Well, it's playbook in the sense that this is very much going to be governance driven. So you've got to start with you start with the board. The board has its accountabilities and responsibilities, but they need to be able to identify within the organisation who the key senior managers are that's going to actually drive this particular standard, and from that you set up your appropriate frameworks, your policies, your processes, your procedures, and it kind of flows down from there. So it starts at the board, it flows down through senior management, down through the different layers, and then it flows back up again because the board needs to be reported to, and needs to be very much across what the risks are, where there's any gaps. When you do your testing, if anything falls out of that, they need to make sure that from a board perspective, any lessons learned are being actioned and implemented. So this is very much all about governance, all about your risk assessments, and how you actually drive that through the organization. So so look, I'll just keep going because I'll just sort of touch that. So just touching a little bit with a little bit more detail about operational risk and assessment. So it says that an APRA entity must maintain a comprehensive assessment of its operational risk profile. They have to maintain appropriate and effective information systems to monitor operational risk, compile and analyze operational risk data, and facilitate reporting to the board and senior management. So like I say, top down in terms of setting the governance framework, and then bottom up in terms of reporting. Secondly, identify and document the processes and resources needed to deliver critical operations. So this is your people, process, technology. Again, that's got to be part of how you go about undertaking this assessment. And then thirdly, undertake scenario analysis to identify and assess the potential impact of severe operational risk events, test its operational readiness, and identify the need for new or amended controls and other mitigation strategies. So you've got to be really proactive. You've got to really be quite critical in terms of what risks you're trying to manage. You've got to be testing your BCP. There's more detail about the sort of scenarios you should be looking at, and then you need to be identifying your controls and testing them and stress testing them, and then updating your processes and anything else that needs to be updated based on how that testing goes. So there's a lot in there. I'll just move on to business continuity, just to pick out some stuff from here. So from a business continuity point of view, you've got to define, identify, and maintain a register of critical operations. Now, that's a SOC crossover. If you kind of remember from SOC discussions, you've got to have this register of your critical operations. That's one of the things. So there's definitely a SOC crossover there. You've got to, as I mentioned in the objectives, maintain a credible BCP that sets out how you would maintain critical operations within tolerance levels through disruptions, including disaster recovery planning for critical information assets. And I just want to touch on this tolerance level concept, which is quite interesting. So what it says is that for each critical operation, so you've got to identify your critical operations, you have to establish these tolerance levels for the maximum period of time an entity would tolerate a disruption to the operation, the maximum extent of data loss the entity would accept as a result of a disruption, and the maximum service levels the entity would maintain while operating under alternative arrangements during a disruption. So you've got to really think through your BCP. You've got to really think through, okay, if we get hit in our operations, can we be down for half an hour, 1 hour, 4 hours, whatever it might be. And during that time, what is the level of service that we're going to be able to maintain through whatever redundancy we put in place? And again, going back to that initial objective, it's got to be proportionate. It's got to be choose your own adventure. So the big banks will be putting a lot of effort into minimizing downtime and trying to maintain the best level of service possible. For a smaller APRA entity, obviously they're not going to be able to invest quite as much as your big banks, but they still have to go through that process and put something in there that's proportionate given the size and the risk appetite of the organization. So that's kind of BCP stuff. And then just finally, just touching on service providers. So you have to have a service provider management policy, and that policy has to include your approach to entering into, monitoring, substituting, exiting agreements with material service providers, and your approach to managing the risks associated with material service providers, and your approach to managing the risks associated with any fourth parties. And that's what I mentioned before, that material service providers rely on to deliver a critical operation to an APRA regulated entity. So a little bit like your critical operations, you've got to identify and maintain a register of material service providers. And this information, all this information where you've got these registers, these lists, you have to provide that to APRA. APRA has the right to come in and do some auditing or make some suggestions if they think that there's some improvements you can make to the way you go about managing, whether it's BCP or whether it's how you engage with these third parties and these fourth parties. So they have some obligations there or some rights there to come in. So that gets reviewed on an annual basis. The board's got to be across all this kind of stuff, and then it goes through in quite a lot of detail the sorts of provisions that APRA wants in these agreements. So these APRA entities will have spent the last couple of years updating their third-party agreements, but also extending that to how that might apply to subbies of your third-party contractors, and that includes again the ability for APRA to come in and do some auditing on these entities to make sure that they don't pose a significant risk to critical operations. So that's kind of it in what was that? That was a 12-minute nutshell or so. But there's some really interesting stuff in
Big
there.
nuts.
I suppose the other thing I would say, obviously, this is very much focused on APRA regulated entities, so your banks, your superannuation schemes, and the like. But you can also, if it's one of those things where if you're in another industry and you're looking for things to look to in terms of how do I manage my operational risk, how do I manage my third-party suppliers, how do I manage my BCP, documents like CPS 230 are quite useful in terms of, okay, well, here's some guidance in another industry. It is principles-based, it's not that prescriptive. However, it's quite useful in kind of going, okay, well, this is what they're doing under APRA. Maybe there's something here that I can actually apply to my industry.
I was going to say, how does that go industry to industry? But I mean, Adam, from a CISO perspective, I mean, obviously everyone's got their own perspective, their own particular set of goggles that they look through for this. What does CPS 230 mean to your average CISO?
So overall, CPS 230, the biggest thing that you're thinking of, especially in such a compliance driven and rich environment as the financial market is, how do I integrate this into my current framework, like ISO 27001, CPS 234, the little brother or big brother of CPS 30? And how do I make sure that the processes and the principles that CPS 2330 have are applied into what I do today already? And that makes it the easiest way to get compliant. The thing that I like about it the most, though, is the proactive nature in it. So it makes you ask those questions that sometimes are a little bit hard to ask in some businesses, like when it comes to BCP and stress testing incident response plans, you have to do it against real world scenarios. And 10 years ago, if you had have said, what happens if our entire business can't make it into the office, you would have gotten laughed at. But that's a legitimate scenario now. The ransomware attacks that are targeting everyone is a legitimate example. And understanding your upstream and downstream risk. If you want to understand about upstream and downstream risk, just have a chat to the guys working through the Qantas issue. Like you see it every single day. But from a CISO perspective, it's all about how do I integrate this into the current processes that I'm using, and how do I use it to amplify what I'm doing?
One of the things here, Robert, that sort of struck me is the fact that this is getting very, it's becoming more prescriptive in terms of how organizations must view risk, how they must actually behave, and what they are responsible for. The thing that struck me most was the fact of coming out of service provision land for, pretty much all of my career. Everybody's looking for 5 nines and, not really understanding how difficult it is to even come close to 5 nines, and now all of a sudden there's a set of sort of like look in the mirror kind of guidelines around. Well, if you think that 5 nines, asking your service provider for 5 nines is relatively easy, how are you going to be able to create your own tolerance for risk around this? This is where it's kind of interesting for me.
Yeah, and sort of go back to one of the themes that I touched on. There's very much a choose your own adventure style to CPS 230. So it might be 5 nines for the big banks. It might be 4 nines for a smaller financial institution. So it really depends on the size of the organization. It's all about being proportionate. This is there's a lot in here that these financial institutions are being asked to do. It's going to be interesting to see how APRA views a much smaller organization and what they decide to do. So they might pick, 4 nines or 3 nines or 1 9 or whatever it might be. And is that actually meeting CPS 230? Don't know. So, I think with anything, my advice is always if you're unsure, have a chat to the regulator, and it's better to be open with the regulator and say, well, this is what we're thinking about doing. What do you think, guys? And actually have that sort of open dialogue up front, rather than a couple of years down the line when you have an event and APRA goes, well, that's not appropriate, or whatever it might be. But have that discussion sooner
True.
rather than later, and test your approach to 230 based on your organization, rather than just sort of sit there, with your fingers crossed, hoping that everything's okay.
Yeah, I guess. Look, we could go on about 230 all day, but it is now in 1st of July. I mean, so if you're not prepared already, then kind of you're going to be in for a sweat over the next couple of weeks,
Yeah.
because and months even, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done around just your 15 pages.
Yeah.
And aligned with 234 as well. I mean, it's putting an incredible amount of stress into organizations to be able to understand what they've got to do, how they've got to do it. And it's a big change, right? I mean, from where they've been to where they're going. Moving on. Scattered Spider update from Microsoft, a story from Info Security magazine. Microsoft has highlighted Scattered Spider's evolving tactics and confirmed that the group has been observed using new tactics to gain access to cloud environments. Now then, Microsoft said recent activities have involved impacting both on-premise accounts and infrastructure at the initial stage of an intrusion before transitioning to cloud access. The group has also been observed deploying Dragon Force ransomware. And interestingly, Microsoft highlight that the ransomware deployment had a particular focus on VMware ESX hypervisor environments. Well, wouldn't they say that anyway? I guess. But the group continues to use an aggressive social engineering tactics to gain access and manipulate the service desk. Now, then, I guess, I mean, there's an awful lot more to this. I mean, obviously, they're doing a lot of things around SMS phishing, using adversary in the middle domains that mimic legitimate organizations. And this is where it kind of gets interesting for me, because the article, I don't know who wrote it, but it must be it was almost like it was a big ad for Microsoft Defender. But Adam, what are your thoughts on this? Because this is right up your street, right?
Yeah, so Scattered Spider is interesting adversary to start with. So first of all, they were originally called Octo Tempest. Doesn't sound as cool though. So they were tracked as Octo Tempest while they were finding out what they've done. They've hit like MGM Grand, and those types are the MGM reports was probably the biggest. The big difference in what they've done is the utilizing ransomware on the backend infrastructure for your services is huge. So in this case, it was VMware, but it could quite easily have been any other type of hypervisor, which is used in the backend of Azure. It's used in the backend of Amazon. So these type of attacks are quite interesting in how they've gone through. The biggest thing that I've seen with these guys is their shift to what's actually local infrastructure. So the fact that they'll talk to
Right.
help desk to get connections in, they'll utilize tools like this fella here, which the keen-eyed will see as a flipper. To be able to connect into the network from physical perspectives, and utilize all those types of tools that are out there at the moment to get to where they go through. And the man in the middle attacks, the biggest ones they've done with airlines is they will send you to a page that looks like Okta or your CMS login page, and then you'll just put your credentials in and they harvest that way. So they're very smart in how they do things. They've really changed the focus of attacking cloud to attacking access and local infrastructure.
Wow, it's a big change, Robert. I mean, this is a big change, right? In a big shift in terms of where they're going and what they're doing, and this is evolving.
Yeah, I mean, the sophistication around social engineering has been growing over time, and it's probably helped by the advances in generative AI as well as just sort of increased sophistication in terms of what social engineering tricks work, and so yeah, we see these growing number of similar looking data breaches attacking all sorts of industries, attacking third parties, and as we mentioned with 234th parties as well. So it's look, I'll come back to what we keep saying. You're not going to win this overall battle with these sorts of organizations. They're just going to keep hacking, and they're going to keep finding ways in. They're going to look for the weak spots. They're going to look for the individual who makes that mistake. So it's great having all those layers of defense, but there's always going to be a weak point, and 9 times out of 10, it's probably one of the humans in that particular chain that's going to be the weak spot. And so attention has to turn to the data that the hackers want, and more often than not, organizations just are not paying enough attention to.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we spoke last week about the fact that there are three or four people that have been arrested in the UK. Scattered Spider looks to be pretty much scattered. I mean, there seems to be an awful lot of links to this particular spider,
Mhm.
maybe more than the usual 8. I don't know, but I mean, it's just it seems to be quite a nothing seems to be stopping them at this moment in time, and organizations are pretty much, some of them at least, have got an open door policy, because they're not actually guarding their back door. They're not even guarding their front door, really. But I mean, this is where we're going, I guess.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, well, that was Chat DPS for this week. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to catching up with you again very soon.
Take care, all.
Thank you.